What happens when the President of the United States walks into an Air Force mess hall and stops cold at one empty tray? This wasn't planned, there were no cameras rolling. But what he did next left every soldier in that room speechless and the entire nation talking. It was supposed to be just another ordinary lunchtime at Andrews Air Force Base. The mess hall buzzed with its usual energy, conversations flowing from table to table, bursts of laughter echoing against the high ceilings, and the familiar clatter of trays and silverware filling the air. The smell of grilled chicken, fries, and coffee lingered, mixing with the faint scent of floor polish and fresh uniforms. Rows of young airmen sat shoulder to shoulder, squeezed into the long cafeteria-style tables, catching up with friends between bites of their meals. Some sat scrolling through their phones, checking messages from home, laughing at memes, or updating social media. Others joked around, tossing balled-up napkins at their buddies, their voices mixing with the background noise of lunchtime chatter. For these men and women, it was a brief moment of downtime between duties. Some had just come off long shifts. Others were preparing for afternoon drills. But for everyone in that room, it was just another day on base. Until everything changed. Without warning, without a big announcement, without the usual build-up that comes with a presidential visit. President Donald J. Trump walked in. There were no reporters flooding the entrance. No big television crews with bright lights. Only a small, tight group of Secret Service agents surrounding him as he stepped through the wide double doors. The effect was immediate and electric. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Forks and spoons froze halfway to mouths. Drinks were left untouched on trays. A few stunned service members stood up automatically, snapping to attention almost out of muscle memory. Others sat wide-eyed, trying to process what they were seeing. Trump didn't make a grand announcement. There was no booming introduction or formal speech. He simply smiled, waved casually, and started making his way between the tables. He moved slowly, shaking hands with anyone who reached out. He offered fist bumps to younger airmen and gave shoulder pats to the older ones. "How's the food today?" He joked with a group of guys near the salad bar, drawing chuckles. Some soldiers scrambled to pull out their phones, fumbling with excitement to snap quick photos or capture a short video. Others stayed frozen, still unsure if this was real or some elaborate prank. But as Trump moved through the room, something became clear. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't here for a staged photo op. He was taking his time, making eye contact, cracking jokes, asking about their work, their families, their hometowns. A young airman named Tyler stood to shake Trump's hand and nervously introduced himself. "From Ohio, sir," he said. Trump smiled back and said, "Ohio. Great place, full of patriots." The room laughed. Another group of airmen near the drink station called out, "Welcome, Mr. President." Trump grinned and gave them a thumbs up. For a few minutes, it felt less like a presidential visit and more like an old friend dropping by unexpectedly. But as Trump neared the back of the mess hall, something caught his eye. In the far corner, tucked away from the main seating area, sat a single, small table. Unlike the others, this table had no plates piled with food, no cups, no napkins with scribbled notes from friends. Instead, it had just one tray, completely empty. Placed carefully in the center was a folded napkin, a salt shaker, a lemon slice, and standing tall next to it, a miniature American flag. Trump slowed down. His expression shifted. The smile faded slightly as he focused on that small display. He pointed toward it and, turning to one of his nearby staffers, asked quietly but firmly, "What's that table for?" Before the staffer could answer, a senior non-commissioned officer who had been sitting nearby stood up and approached the president. "Sir, that's our missing man table," the officer explained with a steady voice. "We keep it here every day to honor the brothers and sisters who never made it home." Trump nodded slowly, absorbing the meaning behind those words. The entire room seemed to sense the emotional turn of the moment. Conversations that had started to resume earlier fell silent again. Even those who hadn't noticed the missing man table before now followed Trump's gaze. What had started as a surprise presidential drop-in was suddenly turning into something more. Trump walked over, stood in front of the empty tray, and took a deep breath. The room, filled with hundreds of airmen, grew so quiet you could hear the hum of the overhead lights. And at that moment, without anyone saying a word, everyone knew this wasn't just another lunch anymore. The president's unexpected visit had turned into a powerful reminder of sacrifice, service, and the brave men and women who would never sit at that table again. As Trump moved toward the far side of the room, something unusual caught his eye. Amid the sea of crowded tables, trays filled with burgers, fries, mashed potatoes, and fresh fruit, there sat one tray that stood out, not because of what was on it, but because of what wasn't. It was completely empty. No plate, no cup, no utensils. Just a single, spotless tray placed with care at a small table positioned quietly in the corner of the mess hall. At first glance, some might have assumed someone had forgotten it. Maybe a soldier had stepped away. But as Trump's eyes locked on it, he knew this wasn't a forgotten seat. The tray sat perfectly centered. A folded white napkin rested on top. Next to it, a slice of lemon, some salt grains, and standing tall and proud, a miniature American flag planted in a small holder. Trump's pace slowed immediately. His smile faded, replaced by something deeper and more serious. His normally lively stride became deliberate. Step by step, he moved toward the table, ignoring the growing crowd of curious eyes behind him. As he stood before the empty tray, he pointed quietly, then turned toward one of the airmen standing nearby. His voice, though calm, was low and filled with genuine curiosity. "What's this about?" he asked. For a moment, no one answered. It was as if the room held its collective breath. Then, from one of the nearby tables, an older non-commissioned officer, his uniform decorated with years of service ribbons, stood up and slowly approached the president. The officer's face was serious, but respectful. His voice steady, though everyone close enough could sense the emotion behind it. "Sir, that's our missing man table," the officer explained, nodding toward the empty tray. "We keep it set up here every day, as a tribute. It's for the brothers and sisters we lost, the ones who never made it home." Trump stayed silent for a long moment. The words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. The surrounding airmen grew quieter still. Forks were set down. Conversation ceased. Even the sound of kitchen staff moving in the back faded into the background as attention zeroed in on the corner of the room where the president stood. Trump took a step closer to the table, leaning in slightly, looking over each detail: the crispness of the napkin, the brightness of the lemon slice, the solemnity of the flag, standing tall and still. Some who stood nearby noticed that Trump's expression had shifted. Gone was the playful, joking tone he'd had just moments earlier as he greeted troops. Now his face was thoughtful, even emotional. With no cameras rolling, no media capturing the moment, Trump did something unexpected. Slowly, he raised his right hand and placed it firmly over his heart. He stood there for several long seconds, showing a silent but powerful gesture of respect. The entire mess hall followed, without needing an order, without anyone calling for attention. Dozens, then hundreds of airmen stood to their feet. Conversations stopped entirely. Chairs scraped quietly against the floor as service members pushed back to stand tall, facing the table. Some stood with hands at their sides. Others instinctively placed hands over their hearts. A few snapped to attention, and then silence. For nearly a full minute, the entire hall remained completely still. No one ate. No one moved. Some lowered their heads. A few wiped their eyes. Others stood with their gaze fixed on the small flag at the table's center, thinking of friends, fellow soldiers, and family members who had worn the same uniform but never returned home. Even members of Trump's Secret Service detail, normally laser-focused on security, stood still and joined the quiet tribute. After the moment passed, Trump slowly lowered his hand and turned to the officer who had spoken earlier. "I appreciate you telling me," Trump said softly, his voice quieter than usual but clear. "This means something. To all of us." The officer nodded. "Thank you for noticing, sir." Trump glanced around the room, taking in the faces of the young men and women standing in silence, faces that represented sacrifice, courage, and service. He let out a slow breath, nodded once more toward the missing man table, and then began walking back toward the center of the mess hall. As he did, the airmen slowly returned to their seats. Conversations resumed in hushed tones. Forks picked up again, but with a different energy now, a deeper, more reflective mood that settled across the room. That empty tray had spoken louder than any speech. And in that brief, unplanned moment, the president, the troops, and every person in that hall were united, not by politics, not by titles, but by remembrance, respect, and a shared understanding of sacrifice. For a long moment, Trump said nothing. He just stood there, staring at the empty tray, the carefully folded napkin, and the small but powerful American flag, standing tall at the center of the missing man table. The air in the mess hall felt heavier by the second. What had started as a casual, unscripted presidential visit had shifted into something far more meaningful. Finally, breaking the long, respectful silence, Trump slowly raised his right hand and placed it firmly over his heart. His movements were deliberate, steady, and filled with sincerity. Then, in a gesture that surprised everyone watching, he bowed his head slowly and deeply. It wasn't the quick, polite nod often seen at public events. This was different. This was personal. Without a single instruction, without anyone shouting attention. The entire mess hall followed his lead. Forks clattered softly onto trays. Chairs pushed back against the floor. Hundreds of airmen, officers, and enlisted alike stood in unison. From the youngest recruits to the most senior leaders, every person in that room rose to their feet. Some stood at attention, their eyes locked forward. Others placed their own hands over their hearts. A few lowered their heads in quiet reflection. For nearly a full minute, no one moved. There was no sound except for the faint hum of the ceiling fans and the distant clinking from the kitchen staff, who had also paused once they noticed what was happening. Some of the younger airmen wiped tears from their eyes, not ashamed of showing emotion in front of their peers. A few officers, hardened by years of service and loss, stood blinking hard, swallowing against the lump forming in their throats. Even members of Trump's Secret Service detail, normally stoic and laser-focused on their surroundings, stood respectfully at attention near the back wall. It was one of those rare moments when rank, role, and responsibility disappeared, and all that remained was shared humanity and honor for the fallen. After what felt like both a blink and an eternity, Trump slowly lifted his head and lowered his hand from his chest. The room remained quiet, eyes now focused on him, waiting for what he would say next. When he finally spoke, it wasn't with the booming, rally-style voice people were used to hearing from him. His tone was softer, measured, emotional, but controlled. "You know," he began, pausing to steady his voice, "when I walk into a room like this, I see strength. I see sacrifice. I see America at its finest." His eyes swept across the rows of airmen standing before him. "But moments like this, they remind me, and they should remind all of us, of what's really at stake." There was another small pause. A few airmen shifted on their feet, but remained silent, listening. "We enjoy freedoms every single day that most people in the world can only dream of," Trump continued. "The ability to sit down for a meal, to laugh with friends, to go home to our families at the end of the day. But those freedoms aren't free. They've been paid for by brave men and women like you, and by the ones who aren't here with us today." A ripple of emotion moved across the room. Some airmen nodded quietly. Others stared at the table, remembering friends they'd lost on deployments. Trump took a small step forward and pointed toward the missing man table. "That tray, that flag, that empty seat, it's a reminder. A powerful one. Not just for you, but for all of us." His voice, though soft, was steady with conviction. "And I want you to know something," he added, his gaze now moving table to table. "As long as I have anything to say about it, this country will never forget, will never ignore, and will always honor the sacrifices you and your brothers and sisters make." At that, spontaneous applause erupted from the back of the room and quickly spread forward. It wasn't the forced, polite applause of a formal event. It was raw, real, loud. Some clapped with hands still shaking slightly from emotion. Others cheered, letting out proud hooahs and auras. A few simply stayed standing in silent reflection, their eyes still locked on the missing man table. Trump stepped back, giving the room a small, appreciative smile. He gave a short wave, and nodded in gratitude to the senior officer who had first explained the table's meaning. The moment had ended, but its weight lingered. For many in that room, it would become one of the most unforgettable moments of their military career. An ordinary lunch, transformed by one empty tray, a quiet presidential gesture, and a reminder that no one who serves this country is ever truly forgotten. Later that day, as the afternoon sun began to set over Andrews Air Force Base, the story of what had just happened inside the mess hall began to spread. Quietly at first, like a ripple moving across still water. A few service members, still processing the emotional weight of the moment, pulled out their phones and began sharing their thoughts on social media. One young airman, just 22 years old and stationed at the base for less than a year, posted on Twitter, "Today, the president didn't come here with cameras. He didn't give a campaign speech. He stood with us, honored our missing man table, and reminded us why we serve." The post included a blurry but powerful photo. Trump standing quietly beside the empty tray, his hand over his heart, eyes down in a moment of reflection. Another airman uploaded a video clip showing the entire mess hall standing in unified silence. Hundreds of men and women, shoulder to shoulder, heads bowed, with a small American flag on the missing man table visible in the corner of the frame. Within hours, those posts began gaining traction. First, other airmen stationed at Andrews began retweeting, commenting, and sharing their own photos and perspectives from the day. Then friends and family members back home saw the posts and shared them again. Soon, military forums and veteran Facebook groups picked them up. By evening, hashtags like #MissingManMoment and #PresidentialRespect started trending on Twitter. News networks, always quick to pick up on viral content, began running segments on the story. The photos and videos appeared on major outlets like Fox News, CNN, and even non-political sites like BuzzFeed and the Daily Mail. Headlines read, "President Trump's quiet tribute. Mess hall moment goes viral. Unscripted, unfiltered. President honors fallen troops during surprise base visit beyond politics. A moment of humanity from the Commander-in-Chief." Veterans organizations like the American Legion and VFW reposted the photos on their official pages. They praised the moment as a rare and genuine act of presidential empathy. Families of fallen soldiers started commenting too. One Gold Star mother from Texas wrote, "My son never came home from Afghanistan. I've seen presidents shake hands and deliver speeches. But this right here, this touched me more than words can explain." Another father of a Marine who died overseas wrote, "For once, it wasn't about politics. It was about remembering our kids. Thank you for that moment." The story even made its way onto international news. Outlets from the UK, Australia, and Canada ran pieces on the viral images showing the president standing still and silent before the empty tray. What stood out most to many people was how raw and unplanned it all seemed. There were no teleprompters, no press releases sent out beforehand, no carefully positioned cameras waiting to catch the perfect angle. One military blogger wrote, "This wasn't the typical PR stunt. You can see it in the body language. This was a leader standing face to face with the reality of service and sacrifice." Even those who weren't typically fans of Trump found themselves sharing the clip. One viral Facebook comment read, "I don't agree with a lot of what this president says or does, but today, this wasn't about politics. This was about respect. Plain and simple." Within 24 hours, the original tweets from the airmen had gathered over 2 million views. The short video clip of the moment of silence had been shared over 500,000 times across multiple platforms. Radio stations discussed the story during their morning segments. Newspapers included it in their weekend editions. And at Andrews Air Force Base, the service members who had been there that day kept talking about it long after the president's motorcade had left. Some described how they had never seen a sitting president so emotionally affected in real time. Others admitted they'd never really thought much about the missing man table before, but after that day, they'd never walked past it again without remembering what it stood for. Back in Washington, D.C., White House staffers reported that Trump himself had mentioned the visit later that evening. One insider shared that during a late-night meeting, Trump told his team, "That was something special today. Those kids, that table. I'll remember that." Over the following days, requests came in for the president to speak more on the topic of military families and the sacrifices made by service members. And while Trump didn't give a formal speech about that specific visit immediately, those who had been in that mess hall that day didn't need more words. They had seen what happened. They had felt it. And thanks to the power of a few posts from young airmen, now millions of Americans and people around the world had witnessed it too. One empty tray, one quiet moment, and a story that reminded everyone what honor, respect, and remembrance truly mean. In the days that followed, Andrews Air Force Base found itself at the center of something much larger than anyone had anticipated. What started as a quiet, unscripted moment between the president and a room full of airmen had turned into a national conversation. Letters began arriving at the base's mailroom by the dozens. Some were from school children who had seen the story on TV. They colored American flags with crayons and wrote short notes saying things like, "Thank you for being heroes," and "We love our soldiers." Others came from elderly veterans who hadn't worn a uniform in decades, but still carried the weight of their own service. One letter, written in shaky handwriting, simply said, "Thank you for remembering the ones we lost." That table, it meant more than you know. Care packages followed, boxes filled with snacks, socks, thank you cards, and even hand-sewn quilts started piling up. Local businesses sent gift cards. Churches organized prayer chains specifically for the airmen stationed at Andrews. One florist in Maryland even sent fresh flowers daily for a week, requesting they be placed on the missing man table as a continuing tribute. And then, during a speech the following week at a veterans event, Trump officially referenced the moment for the first time in public. Standing before a crowd of thousands, with cameras rolling and flags waving in the background, he paused mid-speech, lowered his voice, and said, "I walked into a mess hall, and one empty tray told the whole story." The audience grew quiet as he continued. "It reminded me that every decision we make, every policy we debate, every law we pass, it all comes down to one thing: never forgetting the people who give everything for this country." Applause broke out. Not the kind of applause that comes from political agreement, but the slow, rising kind that comes from deep emotional connection. Back at Andrews, the airmen who had stood in that mess hall felt a surge of pride, hearing the president share their experience with the nation. Some of them watched the speech together on a small TV in the barracks rec room. Others got calls from family and friends back home saying, "Hey, did you hear? He mentioned your base." For the Jacobs family, it felt especially personal. Their son, Staff Sergeant Daniel Jacobs, had been sitting just 3 tables away from the missing man table that day. He had stood in silence, hand over heart, just like the rest of his brothers and sisters in uniform. When his parents heard about what happened and later saw the photos online, they called Daniel with tears in their eyes. "We're proud of you," his father said, "not just for serving, but for being part of that moment." Daniel later shared with friends that standing in that room, in total silence with the president standing just feet away, was one of the most powerful experiences of his military career. News outlets continued covering the story for days. Online, the photos and videos kept circulating. Military families across the country posted their own tributes, sharing photos of their loved ones who hadn't come home, often captioning them with a now viral phrase, "One empty tray," tells the whole story. Some schools even added lessons about the missing man table to their Veterans Day programs, inspired by what they saw from that day at Andrews. Veterans organizations printed the photo of Trump standing at the table and mailed it out as part of newsletters, with captions like "A moment of honor" and "When leadership means remembering." For many airmen stationed at Andrews, the memory stayed fresh long after the news coverage faded. Walking into the mess hall weeks later, they glanced toward the missing man table with new reverence. Some would pause for just a second longer than before. Others, when walking in with new recruits, would stop and say, "Hey, let me tell you what happened here." It became part of the base's oral history, a story retold to new airmen arriving for duty. One empty tray, a folded napkin, a miniature flag, and a president who, in that one unscripted moment, showed that beyond politics, beyond speeches, beyond media headlines, there was still room for raw, genuine human connection. That simple visit had left behind something no one could script, a legacy of respect. And for the families who had lost loved ones, for the troops serving day after day, and for every person who saw that photo online, the story became more than just an internet headline. It became a reminder, a promise, that behind every uniform, behind every salute, there's a story worth honoring. And that as long as that tray stays empty, they will never be forgotten. If this story inspired you, give it a like, hit subscribe for more powerful moments like this, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss what's next. Thanks for watching.